Okay, so we're back with Thomas Taylor on Aristotle's philosophy, and we're in this chapter looking more into the nature of generation. Taylor promised us some thoughts by Simplicius on this topic, but then just kind of went into it, and there was no clear transition into Simplicius's thought compared to his own. And so I'm really not sure if what we're reading is actually Thomas Taylor. This would be like the only chapter that was primarily written by him, if that's the case. So this is either Taylor or Simplicius. Pick up a little bit before where we left off last time. But when contraries, such as earth and water, through the natural difficulty of mixture, remain contending with each other according to their contrary qualities, then it is necessary that one of these prevailing should be increased from the diminution of the other, and that from such a symmetry of the elements, composite bodies or forms should be naturally adapted to be generated, such, for instance, as the form of an ox or a horse. But from the symmetry of some other form inserted in the elements, according to an excess or diminution of the elements and other aptitudes, bees are generated from an ox, beetles from a horse, and different worms from different animals and plants. Okay. One thing about generation is it's always a battle between contraries, and that reflects Proclus's view in the Timaeus commentary as well. Footnote 5. The moderns, admitting no other criterion of truth than experiment, know nothing solidly of parts, and have no knowledge whatever of wholes. Hence they see not the power of nature herself as a whole, and that wherever there is a fit and properly adapted matter, she can produce an animal spontaneously. See more of this in the introduction to my translation. Okay? So he's disagreeing with this modern view that animals don't spontaneously generate. I think there's a technical term for that. The theory that organisms like manifest from putrefaction and different natural processes. It's something like spontaneous generation, but there's another term for it. That's all right. Not super relevant. Sometimes, too, a great excess of some one of the elements taking place in composite bodies, or the elements themselves becoming weak and old, they are unadapted to the reception of the composite form. Okay, so when the material components are out of proportion or they're deteriorated, then the form fails, not from a failure of formal cause, but material cause. Makes sense. And the elements can become weak and old according to the Timaeus. The triangles eventually degrade. Then, being dissolved, they fall into their proper wholes, and being there renewed and invigorated, they again pass into composition. Okay, so their proper wholes is not totally clear. I guess as the triangles break down, they kind of go back into forming the new triangles, so they exist in like a seminal state of undivided form, like the purest form of matter, and then they differentiate again, I suppose. Yeah, we'll keep an eye out in the Timaeus commentary for exactly how that process is described. But water especially manifests this, for it then especially becomes adapted to generation and nutriment when it is pure, and is divulsed from its proper wholeness, as appears from fountains. Okay, so the wholeness is this undifferentiated state. Water has that, and when it moves forth from that like spring, it is more pure and wholesome and more of the nature of water. And it is evident that generation and corruption here are certain mutations arising from contraries and passing from a contrary to a contrary habit. In the elements, indeed, for instance, in water, a change being made by fire into a condition contrary to water, i.e. the fiery, fire is generated. From the contrary, indeed, to water itself, according to contrary qualities, but by the contrary to water, viz. Fire. For it is necessary that things which are corrupted should be contrary to that which corrupts them, and that what is generated should be similar to its maker. Okay, so corruption comes from contraries, generation comes from similars. So that's interesting. And just because I thought of it now, do either of you remember the kind of Aristotelian argument for entropy? That's what I called it before, where things tend rather to degrade because, I think it was an intrinsic property of motion, right? Yeah, time naturally leads to degradation, destruction. And I think basically the point was that motion is a movement away from a natural condition. And so like the fact that the world involves constant motion means things are constantly falling away from their like proper form, I suppose. And this also is well, it's like a recycling cosmos concept, but the idea is that when things are first made, they're purest and best, and then they degrade from there. Also similar to Plato's concept in The Statesman of this kind of rejuvenating cosmos as a whole. Okay. But the fabrication of the elements is a mutation in itself of agents from patients. Mutation in itself of agents from patients. The subjects being adapted to either of these, and the corruption, again, of a contrary is affected from a contrary. I'm not sure the mutation in itself of agents from patients in the fabrication of the elements. I suppose that this is material cause. So the patient is the matter, agent is the form. Mutation in itself of agents from patients. So the form is instantiated according to the appropriateness, which is connected to that previous thought, that the material substrate can be out of proportion or it can degrade. But when the material portion or proportions, are right, then the agent or the formal principle is able to instantiate mutation in itself of agents. Maybe that's what is meant there. Not totally sure. The subjects being adapted to either of these, and the corruption again of a contrary is affected from a contrary. For water is corrupted by fire into fire, and hence the corruption of one thing is the generation of another, and the generation of one thing the corruption of another, the qualities departing into non-being. For when fire is generated from water, the cold and moist quality recedes, the corporeal essence receiving the qualities of fire. And this indeed takes place when from the essence of water, a mutation is effected into another essence, viz. That of fire. But when the energy and passive affection of the elements on each other, according to qualities, becomes more imbecile, so as to produce a disposition towards each other from themselves, and water still remaining, water is heated, then a mutation of water is said to be effected. Rather than a transmutation, we have just a mutation. So water failing to energize according to the natural disposition of water. So I guess a hot spring is sort of like faulty water, as opposed to a genuine transformation into fire. So yeah, so you could look at the destruction and generation cycle when contraries come from contraries as the strength of the contravening form asserting itself, but then there's another kind of degradation of the elements. Let's read this sentence again. But when the energy and passive affection of the elements on each other, according to qualities, becomes imbecile, so as to produce a disposition towards each other from themselves, and water still remaining, water is heated, then a mutation of water is said to be effected. So there's like a blending of, basically when the water is not pure and the form is not purely instantiated, then a kind of muddled down, blended, non-distinct aspect appears, and water loses its unique formal characteristics. And you would expect the same to be true. So like old air or like degraded fire would have those kind of more generic elemental characteristics, whereas the pure water, pure fire, the new stuff, it's rejuvenated, that'll be more formally distinct. I think that's the thought. But when fire, still remaining fire, is refrigerated or moistened, then a change in the quality of fire is said to be effected, and that which happens is a passion. So a disposition of the element itself, not a transmutation. Because one essence is not produced from another, but a change in quality is alone effected. It is also evident that not any casual it is also evident that not any casual disposition is produced from any disposition, but a contrary from a contrary. So even when even when the transmutation is not affected, the refrigeration of fire is still caused from the water aspect of fire, even if water doesn't fully occupy the place that fire formerly had. For that which is refrigerated is not refrigerated by dryness, but by coldness, and that which suffers from an agent, and from an agent according to its own nature and by its very essence. So the cause of these qualities is always going to be the proper cause. So heat will come from fire, dryness from air, coldness from earth, wetness from water, even when they appear in the other elements, and even when one element doesn't supersede or actually appear in one place, still even a passive change in quality of fire or water or whatever will take place from the proper agent, or proper agency rather, of the cause of the thing. So one of the other elements, although it's not fully instantiated, is still the cause of the change in quality. Since those things which act according to nature act in this manner, and the passion which they suffer is such as was the quality of the agent. That's like from the Gorgias, the affection of the patient answers to the affection of the agent. So in any action, how the receiver of the action is affected accords with the nature of the doer. Which they suffer is such as was the quality of the agent, or according to which the agent makes and energizes. So if the agent doesn't act from its essence, but acts from some accidental quality that it has, the passion of the recipient will answer to the manner in which the agent was energizing, not necessarily according to its own essence. I think that's just like leaving room for that kind of caveat. Or it may be said that the agent naturally and essentially imparts such a passion as was that quality of itself according to which it acts. Yeah, that's the alternative. Naturally and essentially, it imparts a quality of itself, but there's also like violent and accidental action as well. For that which energizes naturally wishes to change that which suffers into itself. That's an interesting general statement. All action is trying to like make other things in your image. But a contrary is changed into a contrary, and the heat in that which is refrigerated is changed into coldness, which is in the refrigeration. But when, as I have said, a change in quality is effected, that which is generated becomes the thing imperfectly, and that which was before hot is refrigerated. Yeah, rather than a transmutation, this change in quality, there's an imperfect reception of the form of the agent. It is not, however, so refrigerated as that what is perfectly made cold is changed into the nature of that which imparts the cold, which happens to be the case with things that are generated and corrupted. So true generation corruption is kind of always a transmutation between opposites, but there's a partial not a full partial mutation, still from contraries, but that leads to like passive changes in quality. In short, that which is a contrary energizes and corrupts that thing, wishing and hastening to change it into itself. Thus air, which is supposed to be hot, does not wish with its own heat to change also the heat of fire, for this can also exist in fire, but it wishes to insert moisture in fire because it is impossible for this to be coexistent with fire. Oh, I think I ascribed dryness to air, but no. So let's, just because it's worthwhile to have this memorized, it does come up pretty often. Earth is, it's all like a square of options with hot, cold, wet, dry. And that gives you the four elements. So earth is going to be dry and cold. Water is wet and cold. Air is hot and wet. And then fire is hot and dry. Okay. And so when two elements share one quality in common, they don't act on each other as contraries, but they can act on each other as contraries insofar as they have contrary properties. So air can act on fire insofar as they are oppositional in terms of wetness and dryness. And fire corrupts moisture, not by heat, essentially, but by dryness, because they share the heat, and so there's no tendency to move between opposites there. Heat also accidentally co-energizes with dryness. Hence, therefore, we may syllogize as follows. Sublunary bodies, which energize naturally, energize in consequence of wishing to multiply themselves. Okay, the natural activities of things are always out of a desire to multiply themselves. Just like the one wants to create things in its image. Things which energize in order to multiply themselves transmute patience into themselves. So I don't know if this implies interesting. There's some arguments about the eternity of the world related to this. If this is Simplicius, it would be like in his range of topics to consider is whether there is kind of creation ex nihilo, or whether there's always some patient or potency for emotion or change first. Because that statement taken absolutely implies no creation ex nihilo. Things which energize in order to multiply themselves transmute patience into themselves. So is that like all the way to the one? Does that imply then that like the one doesn't emanate into a non-pre-existing substrate? Does that kind of imply the eternity of the material aspect of all lower levels of reality, because it's there to differentially receive oneness. So hopefully that thought is clear that I'm getting at. I think different Neoplatonists might look at that somewhat differently. So in other words, does the one create all aspects of lower things in its emanation, or is there an eternity to the patiency of lower things that then receives oneness? Okay, but for our purposes in the world of generation, this is not problematic. Things which energize in order to multiply themselves transmute patience into themselves. But things which transmute patience into themselves corrupt such things in the patients as are incapable of coexisting with them. Things which are incapable of coexisting are contraries, but contraries are corrupted by contraries. For things which are able to exist together in a common subject do not corrupt each other. The contraries, therefore, in the patient being corrupted by the contraries in the agent, the subject receiving the qualities or quantities of the agent, instead of the contraries to them which it before possessed, is changed into the nature of the agent. Hence, that which was before water from fire becomes fire, through the heat of air, as a medium, and which first, as more energetic, expels coldness from the water, and afterwards moisture through dryness. Magnitudes. So that implies then also that the change between contraries is going to be affected through media. So you won't go straight from water to fire, but you would kind of go from water to air to fire. Afterwards, moisture through dryness. Magnitudes also, figures, and such things as cannot coexist, change into their contraries. And thus, the corporeal interval of water, and if there is anything else in it more material, receiving qualities contrary to those which it possesses, is changed into fire from water. The common qualities remaining, which are capable of coexisting with each other. Okay? Whether a thing of this kind is some corporeal nature in conjunction with certain common properties, or whether it is the first matter. So, between, air and fire, there's a common property that remains in the substrate. So the matter is not fundamentally transformed, and actually no fundamental transmutation of the principal matter or prime matter takes place, or like most fundamental matter, because that will be in common among all substrates. So by default, any contrary or any generation from opposites is never absolute. There's always some kind of common substrate joining them. For a mutation existing, there must necessarily be something which is permanent, about which the mutation is affected. So change implies stasis at the same time. But this is that which is properly changed according to the departing qualities. Of qualities, therefore, some are corrupted and others are generated, but the subject is changed according to them. This also not only takes place in generation, but also in alienation, or a change in quality. That's like the weaker version. Generation is a total transmutation, alienation is a mutation, but imperfect. For it has been said respecting this, that when a perfect mutation, according to contrary qualities of the agent, is not affected, but an accession only of some things from the others, as water when it is heated, then the patient does not become another thing, but only different in quality. This, therefore, as I have said, not only takes place in these things, but also in natural increase and diminution. Okay. Right, so I guess the options for differences to accede in a substrate is a total transmutation, an aliation, or increase and diminution. And increase and diminution is equated with a change in quality, probably because it's also an imperfect adaptation of the qualities of the agent. So the assimilation of new things into the thing to increase it. I'm not quite remembering why change in quantity or why aliation was always treated as a kind of change in quantity. Hopefully he restates some of that. All right, well, we'll start from here. This, therefore, as I have said, not only takes place in these things, but also in natural increase and diminution. I also think that statement wasn't absolute. I think it was a, for the most part, kind of statement that aliation or change in quality is usually an increase or diminution. Which I guess it would have to be, right? If like the agent doesn't fully impart itself, doesn't fully transform the patient into itself, then it's adding something or potentially taking something away. Some aspects of the patient are removed or some aspects are added from an agent. And that's similar to aliation in that it's an imperfect mutation. So, okay. For that which is naturally increased, as that which is nourished, changes and assimilates to itself the contrary dispositions of the aliment, and thus conjoins them to itself and is increased. Yeah, so we change ourselves by adapting some aspect of the thing consumed when we increase and grow. So that's also an imperfect mutation. If also the nutritive power has anything of a psychical nature, i.e. something belonging to soul, yet at the same time it is thus perfectly according to natural mutations. Okay, so the nutritive power is said to be like the most basic aspect of the soul by Aristotle, the lowest aspect. Like the plant soul basically consists in nutritive power and growth. And so even if it is psychical, yet it's still in accord because it's the lowest grade of psychical motive principles, but it's not that far off from the natural motion of bodies. Things likewise which are locally moved change one place for another, that which is moved remaining what it was before. Hence all sublunary mutation is revolution, that which is changed being permanent according to something. Okay, so all right. All sublunary mutation is a revolution, that which is changed being permanent according to something. So local motion, there's a combination of stasis and change, and so on, as we've seen with all the different types of mutation. He is specifically speaking of sublunary. So before, when it said that all natural energizing occurs on a patient, which is changed into the likeness of the agent, that I think we can interpret as being specifically related to sublunary mutations and actions. So we can keep open the question of a kind of ex nihilo emanation, but not generation. Ex nihilo generation, according to the Aristotelian definition and the concepts we're looking at here, is impossible. But ex nihilo emanation could still be. Hence, all sublunary mutation is a revolution, that which is changed, being permanent according to something. On which account, things which are generated according to time are not generated from non-being, but from being. Yeah, and he says it explicitly. Generated according to time are always from being, not ex nihilo creation regarding the world of generation. And this might be Simplicius, and he might be arguing against someone like John Philoponus, or just Christians in general. For as of the time according to which these are generated, some other time pre-exists after. Okay, I think that we are back. My power went out. Apologize for that. Just want to confirm that everything's good. It looks good. So, where we left off. Yeah, so local motions, there's some stasis, some change. And so in some sense, all sublunary motion is revolution. Something has changed, but something else is permanent. On which account, things which are generated according to time are not generated from non-being, but from being. For as of the time according to which these are generated, some other time pre-exists, after which this succeeds. So likewise of that which is generated, something else pre-exists, after which and from which that which is generated is generated. So, there's always material cause, meaning there's always a substrate. There's always something else pre-existing from which the change is brought about. Very properly, therefore, does Aristotle consider mutation as the genus of all sublunary revolution in natural things. Very properly also is this mutation perpetual, not only because from the perpetual mutation in the heavens, the mutation according to local motion and the different configurations consist, but because the corruption of one thing is always the generation of another. Okay, so by its nature, change, there can't be a first change that isn't according to this notion of mutation. Therefore, something always pre-exists the change. So there can't be a first event. Therefore, time is eternal, perpetual. Very properly, likewise, do simple sublunary bodies remain perpetual in their wholeness, but sustain generation and corruption in their parts. Okay. Yeah. So generation and corruption in their parts, just like the individual thing can transmute into something else, the existence of the fundamental substrate and the whole persists. Parts change. For if the mutation of things is primarily effected after this manner, and if when dissolved, they naturally tend to their proper places and to their proper wholenesses, but the wholes, in a certain respect, remain, sending forth their parts and receiving them back again, and this always in consequence of the perpetuity of mutation. If this be the case, since mutation and generation have an existence, things which are increased and diminished, which are changed in quality, and locally moved, and universally that which sustains mutation, are very properly changed from a contrary habit into a contrary by a cause contrary to themselves. Hence Aristotle, in the first book of his Physics, investigating the principles of natural things which are conversant with generation and corruption, says that they are contraries and that which is the subject of contraries. Okay, so the principles of things conversant with generation and corruption are contraries, and the substrate or the subject of contraries. That's the principles of that which involves generation and corruption. And it is evident that things which are generated or corrupted according to qualities, for instance, according to heat or dryness, possessing contrary qualities, are changed from them. Some things indeed are changed according to the mutation, some things indeed are changed according to the mutual change of qualities. But so far as fire, or so far as man, they are essences, and there is no form contrary to essence or substance. Okay, so just that caveat that they don't receive, so the substrate receives contrary forms, but the the formal cause of a thing doesn't have... Wait a second. But so far as fire, or so far as man, they are essences. And there's no form contrary to essence or substance. There's no... Okay, I'm not exactly sure what's meant. We'll keep reading and get clarification. So some things indeed are changed according to the mutual change of qualities, but so far as fire or so far as man, they are essences, and there is no form contrary to essence or substance. I think Aristotle says that in the categories, that there substances, properly speaking, individual things, or secondary substances, forms, don't have contraries. But fire obviously does have a contrary. So what do you make of that? All right. Hence, with respect to that from which a thing is generated, not as hot or cold, but as man. Okay, so fire, insofar as it's the form, doesn't have contraries. Its qualities have contraries in another form. So fire, qua fire, is not the contrary of water. Instead, the qualities in fire are contrary to the qualities in water. So that's actually pretty useful. So hence, with respect to that from which a thing is generated, not as hot or cold, but as man, it is evident that it is generated from that which is not man indeed, but which is naturally adapted to become man. And a thing of this kind is seed and menstruum. For it will not become man, being already man, since a thing is not generated that which it is. Hence, that which we now call a contrary, according to which a thing not being some particular thing is naturally adapted to become it, is usually called privation. So, when a form instantiates from the lack of that form, in some sense, even that, the generation of a substance like man, a man, is from contrary. It's from privation to the presence of the form in question. But that's a different way than in the way in which material generation takes place from contraries. And a thing is said to be deprived when it has not that form of which it is said to be deprived, but is naturally adapted to have it. So, someone who is blind is deprived of sight. A rock is not blind. They're not deprived of it. Thus, a whelp just born is deprived... Oh, okay, that is the Aristotelian example, so of course, this is probably Simplicius here. Thus, a whelp just born is deprived of sight because it is naturally adapted to have it. But when it is perfectly blind, it is said to be deprived of sight according to another, and not according to this privation. For the sight, in this latter instance, does not return. Yeah, so someone who is always going to be blind is deprived of sight or has a privation of sight, but not in the same way as someone who is temporarily blind. Okay, but generative privation, from which these things which are said to be generated are changed to form, returns to form. Okay, hence when being hot anything becomes cold, it becomes so from that which is not cold, but is naturally adapted to become cold, and on this account it becomes so from the hot. For the dry is not naturally adapted to be changed from the cold into heat, because these two qualities may be coexistent. Okay. I'm just going to keep going. This is all just reiterating that generation is always from contraries. If therefore that which is generated from a contrary form, the same subject in the meantime remaining as the hot from the cold, but this does not pertain to everything which is generated, for it does not pertain to the first subject and to essence, since there is no contrary to essence. So qualities are generated from contraries. Qualities and quantities was specifically highlighted before. And if to be generated from that which is not a certain thing, but is naturally adapted to be that thing, pertains to all things which are changed from contrary forms, if this be the case, Aristotle very properly says that the common principles of generation are form, privation, and a subject. But he calls form and privation contraries, not according to the proper signification of contrary, for both the things that are properly contraries are forms, but he calls them so according to opposition. Right? Contraries are like the extreme members of a spectrum. Privation, possession is a binary distinction. Contraries are not, like, strictly speaking, are contraries on some kind of continuum. So Aristotle there says possession, privation are a type of contrary when he really means it's a type of opposite. For these are opposed to each other. It is necessary also to remember that the first essence or substance is neither properly generated from a contrary nor corrupted into a contrary, because essence is not contrary to essence. But in the first place, it is also generated from its proper privation, and in the next, through the generation of contraries from contraries. And again, it is corrupted through the corruption of contraries. For when the qualities and quantities in the seed and menstruum are changed into the essences contrary to them, and into which they are naturally adapted to be changed, that's the privation of the form in the seed and menstruum to the possession of the form in the new essence. That's using this sensu lato Aristotelian use of contrary. Which they are naturally adapted to be changed, viz. Into those of men, then the form of man is generated. So in a different sense than qualities and quantities can change, essences do come from a type of contrary, but it's contrary, sensu lato. And again, when certain elements exceed, but their contraries being preserved are led to a discordant condition, then the subject is corrupted, but otherwise not. Okay. So the opposition between contraries leads to the corruption of a thing. But if the contrary thing doesn't, like, if we're talking hot and cold, this is obvious. If something is cold and the hotness doesn't enter into it, then the coldness will not be corrupted. The corruption depends on the introduction of the contrary, or the preservation in the thing, as it's said here, of the contrary. I thought this actually did clarify generation and corruption in the Aristotelian and Simplician sense. So, again, assuming a lot of that was Simplicius. But that's good. We'll just preview what the topic will be. The next dogma, which demands our attention in the physiology of Aristotle, is this: that there are not many worlds, or in modern language, many systems. As his arguments in defense of this dogma possess an invincible force and are accompanied with his usual pregnant brevity, I shall give them in his own words, accompanied with the luminous commentary of the accurate Simplicius. So this is a big one, big topic. Are there many worlds? I've said before, I personally subscribe to the many worlds interpretation and a multiverse cosmology. But I also think that, like, Plato's idea that there are many local worlds, but all joined by passages, is the way the multiverse works. There's never, like, there aren't, in other words, parallel universes where they never touch. All the universes touch and influence each other. I think that might be a way of saving this, where there's one system, but many apparent worlds, many domains, you could say, in one vast system. So we'll see if the remarks in this chapter are compatible with that kind of interpretation. So yeah, any thoughts on the reading today? Looking forward to the next chapter. We'll hit that tomorrow, hopefully.